population has been forced to leave their homes. Russia is preventing Ukrainian-grown food from reaching the world market. Also, Russia uses its position in the energy market to exert pressure. High energy prices maintain high levels of global inflation, which most dramatically affects the world's most vulnerable populations. These lies must be overturned. Russia alone is responsible for this crisis. Mr. President, we, the law-abiding member states of the United Nations, are responsible for supporting Ukraine's self-defense and stopping the aggressor. Russia's ability to function in the fields of finance, trade, transport and energy, as well as restrictive measures against individuals and legal entities, must be maintained and strengthened. Belarus, being equally responsible for enabling Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, is also being sanctioned. And with the brave people of Ukraine, contribute to the work of the United Nations. For us, the horrors of war, occupation and harsh rule by a colonial power are within living memories. So is the fight for liberty and restored independence, and the transition to a successful, sustainable economy and the rule of law. We have no wish to dominate or intimidate anyone. We reject the idea of spheres of influence. As smaller states, we have an existential interest in effective multilateralism. Therefore, Latvia will continue to contribute to the work of the United Nations in the spirit of optimism and determination. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Latvia for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Guillermo Lasso Mendoza, Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Guillermo Lasso Mendoza, Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Excellencies, at the beginning of this year, a young man from Colombia, whose name is Mateo, was going about his daily student activities in the east of Europe. As many migrant Latin Americans, Mateo was focused on pursuing his dreams. In this case, he was pursuing his medical degree at the National University of Zaporizhia. However, on one day in February, this dream was transformed into a nightmare due to the absurd war of Russia against Ukraine. And while the whole world witnessed with horror the beginning of a war, the dimensions of which hadn't been seen in decades, Mateo actually experienced this in his own flesh. He found himself very close to the most dangerous military actions, and due to my respect for him and his traumatic experience, I prefer not to disclose these experiences. Now, using his own ingenuity as well as the solidarity of other people, Mateo made use of various means of transport, including on horseback, in order to go directly to the closest border. In the meantime, while all this was taking place in Ecuador, we were in the process of establishing these flights. In one of those flights, Mateo managed to find a seat. His sister is Ecuadorian, and so that transforms him into part of our transnational family. His Colombian parents today reside in Ecuador thanks to special humanitarian visas that have been issued by our government. But it wasn't just Mateo. This same story was experienced by various Colombian, Peruvian, and other Latin American citizens, and even Ukrainians, who managed to escape the war thanks to this enormous diplomatic effort led by our country. I am telling you all this because if you take away just one message from me, I would like it to be the following: that Ecuador is there to help the world. Ecuador leaves relations. They usually mention to me the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, which speaks of sovereign equality of states, territorial integrity, and political independence, resolve disputes, the full respect for human rights, and I could continue. All these are admirable concepts that throughout almost 8 decades have preserved relative stability that today is being challenged. However, I prefer to begin my intervention because those who know me know that I am not a scholar or an academic or an assiduous attendee of international forums. The reality is that most of my life I have cultivated a very simple idea, and this idea is that the only way of generating value is by always in every activity that one carries out, always putting human beings at the center, because it is always in human beings that I place my trust. I place my trust in people. And I am going to tell you precisely why derives its legitimacy from the well-being that it is capable of creating for its citizens. It shouldn't only base its legitimacy in this, but it should renew that legitimacy daily based on the consent from what happens in each one of our small families depends the well-being of the greater family. Its stability depends on it. And ultimately, in the past, marginality and abandonment have been the breeding ground for magic formulas of the most predictable kind of populism. I am speaking of the same populism that then usually drops its mask and shows its true authoritarian face. The same face that, when it is in the government, flirts with dangerous actors that hide beyond some of the threats that today bring us together and lead us to ask, what do we do with these threats and challenges? Challenges have various aspects, but I will always insist that if we want to make sure that these threats remain far from us, it is necessary to start by clearly pointing to the ugly face of authoritarianism. And for that, we always need to, as we go into going in a circle, we need to return to the source, the same source. We need to create opportunities for people. We need a global order where all citizens feel included, connected, and represented. An interdependent order where opportunities flow freely from one corner of our planet to the other. We need a balance in which every day is increasingly more difficult for aspiring dictators to blame their failures on supposed asymmetries of the global order. We need to open the doors of opportunity to more people, to more citizens, and to never close those opportunities on the pretext of the false notion of sovereignty, which in reality is not sovereignty, but rather arrogance. We need to understand that international security is not simply a right that we share. In fact, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, my government has found itself in the strange position of having to inaugurate or launch a fight against a threat that in the past was not confronted head-on, but rather it was concealed. I am speaking of obscure actors who, instead of being fought, were silently accommodated in the hope that no one would notice them. Today, Ecuador is in the midst of a frontal war, an unprecedented war against the traffic of drugs. As mentioned in the last global report on drugs in 2022, Ecuador is the third country in the world with the most cocaine seized. And today, we are stepping up our activities more than ever to maximize the seizures of drugs and to dismantle transnational organizations that transport these drugs. We know that we're not the only ones who are fighting this monster. And by the way, this monster doesn't have only one face, but various faces, such as trafficking and even illegal mining. It is calculated that oscillates between 1.6 and 2.2 trillion dollars. Those are figures that exceed by several factors of 10 the entire economy of a country like Ecuador. However, it would be a mistake to quantify the consequences of transnational crime only in economic terms. We need to also think of, especially in the irreparable losses in terms of the lives lost and dreams destroyed, in the horrifying cries of families, but also in the who was leading this murder. Not only means that Ecuador loses a very important law enforcement official, or that his children will grow up without a father. It is a murder that leaves us an additional lesson, and that is that transnational crime requires a transnational solution, and that we have two options. Or we're going to suffer separately from an enemy that acts in a coordinated fashion in various countries in order to ignore our laws, or we can unite our efforts to vanquish that enemy. The events clearly demonstrate that we need more in Ecuador. It's not just with record seizures, but also with the sacrifice of our officials, and that we're demonstrating that we deserve this assistance and this international. So these are institutions where these officials are working selflessly. I want to take advantage of this opportunity to work together also to combat against gender violence. In the case of Ecuador, the disappearance of a courageous woman, a lawyer, a mother, and daughter should be the symbol of this challenge, of the challenge of combating against violence against women. Ecuador has demonstrated that we're there for the world. The world can count on us, and I'm sure that the world will support us and help us in these challenges. In the area of human mobility, we have taken decisions that have been applauded these days. We're not only maintaining our long trajectory as a transit country, a country that welcomes and is a refuge for migrants, but also traditionally we have been one of the biggest host countries of refugees in the entire Western Hemisphere. But beyond simply welcoming refugees, I want to refer to the treatment that those citizens receive when they enter our country. In Ecuador, we make special efforts to ensure, to guarantee the rights, and especially, more importantly, the integration of migrants, particularly when we're talking about families whose countries of origin do not offer alternatives of a better life, and these people have no other option other than to flee. For example, 500,000 Venezuelans who today live in Ecuador. We're one of the three main destinations for migrants from this country, and in spite of our budgetary difficulties, we provide assistance to this population with healthcare, education, and other social services. We have also begun a long process of regularization of their status. Just think, Mr. President, what this means in a small country such as ours. Now, think about the impact of a population of that size would have on each one of your countries. This is why I repeat, Ecuador is there for the world. The world can count on Ecuador, and I know that the world will support us with this plan for regularizing the status of our Venezuelan brethren who have had to flee their country. I have the firm hope that this will be the case. But it's not just that. Ecuador is also fulfilling its responsibility in the climate crisis as a country that is the emitter of greenhouse gases. We represent barely 0.18% of global emissions, and yet, without the need to wait or the need to suggest to us, my government to adopt a cross-cutting policy towards environmental transition, including creating a special ministry for this. And this is not merely an issue of how much a country has industrialized in the past, but rather how much a country can contribute in the future. This is why almost a year ago, in the framework of the conference, the climate conference in Glasgow, I announced the creation of a new marine reserve called Hermandad, or Brotherhood, in the Galapagos Islands, which increased by 60,000 square kilometers of the East Tropical Pacific. This was we signed this together with a new dimension and political impetus to the goals of the Marine Corridor.